Innate Ink Publishing presents Raven Blood, a prequel novella in the Wings of Rebellion series. By Bree. Copyright 2024. A runaway with secrets. A vampire with answers. Blood is the price for the truth. Harper has spent years running. From foster homes, from the system, and from the truth about who she is. But her brother Quinn is still out there, lost to a world of shadows and whispers. With nowhere left to turn, Harper dives headfirst into the dangerous supernatural underground, where secrets are currency, and survival is never guaranteed. When a vampire informant offers her a lead on Quinn's whereabouts, Harper knows there's a catch. Viktor is ruthless, and his price for information isn't cheap. To gain his help, Harper must take a risk that could expose her ravenborn nature to the very hunters she's been avoiding. Trust is a luxury she can't afford, and every step deeper into Viktor's world tightens the noose around her neck. How far will Harper go to find her brother? And what will it cost her in the end? In a world where blood opens doors, and betrayal waits in the dark, Harper must decide if the truth is worth risking her life and her freedom. Chapter 1. The rain never stopped in Portland. It fell in cold sheets that soaked through Harper's threadbare hoodie, turning the grime on her skin into muddy streaks. She pulled the hood lower over her face, glancing both ways before she darted across the street. Puddles soaked her sneakers. No one looked twice at her. That was the good thing about cities. People were too busy surviving to care about the girl with haunted eyes and a bloody backpack slung over one shoulder. She found a narrow alley between two buildings and ducked inside, pressing her back against the damp brick wall. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. The air reeked of mildew and rotten trash, but at least it was quiet here. Quiet meant she could stop for a moment. The ache in her back flared again, sharp and insistent. Harper winced, rolling her shoulders to fight it off. The burning pain beneath her skin had started hours ago, like it always did when she was running too hard for too long. She bit her lip to keep from groaning, pressing her palm against the small of her back, where the base of her wings lay hidden. "Not here," she muttered, the words trembling out of her mouth. "Not now." Letting them out would only make things worse. That's what she told herself, over and over. It wasn't just the agony of the feathers tearing through skin. It was what came afterward. Blood soaking the fabric of her shirt. The dizziness. The feeling of being less human and more other. And worse, the risk of being seen. People like her didn't get second chances. She slid down the wall until she was crouched low, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The cold seeped into her bones. It was hard to remember what warmth felt like, or what it was like to wake up and not feel afraid. Keep moving, she thought. Don't stop for too long. Don't let them find you. But moving meant finding food, and she'd run out of ways to get it. Her last stolen slices of bread and peanut butter had been eaten yesterday, and the dollar crumpled in her jacket pocket wasn't enough for anything. If she didn't figure something out soon, she wasn't sure she'd have the strength to keep running. Harper tilted her head back against the brick and let her mind drift to Quinn, her brother, the only family she had left. She remembered the way he'd looked at her before they were separated, somehow smiling as he said, "We'll find each other again. Promise." That promise had become her lifeline. Quinn was out there somewhere, and she'd find him if it killed her. But the world didn't make it easy. It was all whispers and dead ends. Underground communities of paranormals existed. She'd always known that much. But getting answers out of anyone was next to impossible, even though she was one of them. Someone in that underground world had to know what happened to Quinn. She just had to survive long enough to find them. "Hey!" A voice rang out from the street. Harper's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Footsteps echoed closer, and she shoved herself to her feet. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her backpack. For a brief, wild second, she thought about using her wings to get out of here. They could carry her, just far enough to disappear. But then she remembered the blood, the pain, the risk. No, she wasn't that desperate yet. She bolted out the other end of the alley, her shoes skidding on the wet pavement. She didn't look back to see who had shouted. It didn't matter. On the streets, anyone calling for you was trouble. Harper weaved between parked cars and across intersections, the rain blurring her vision. By the time she slowed, she was 2 blocks away, tucked behind an abandoned bus shelter. Her breaths came sharp and shallow. "Keep it together," she whispered to herself, rubbing her arms to fight the chill. "You're fine. You're fine." But she wasn't fine. She was starving, exhausted, and running out of places to go. Harper looked around the street, her gaze lingering on a convenience store at the corner. The lights buzzed dully in the windows, and a man behind the counter stared blankly at his phone. Her stomach twisted. She'd tried not to steal again, not after the last time she'd nearly been caught. But desperation pushed guilt aside. She slid her hands into her pockets, steeling herself. If she was quick, she could grab something small, just enough to last the night. She squared her shoulders and started for the store, her head down, her steps purposeful. The plan was simple. Walk in, grab food, walk out. Don't hesitate. Don't run, unless you have to. The bell over the door jingled when she stepped inside. The store smelled like stale popcorn and burnt coffee. Harper's eyes scanned the aisles, landing on a rack of granola bars near the counter. Perfect. She moved toward them, forcing herself to look casual. Her fingers brushed over a bar as she glanced toward the cashier. He was still staring at his phone. Harper's hand closed around the bar, sliding it quickly into her pocket. She turned on her heel, her pulse thundering in her ears as she made her way back to the door. Almost there. The cashier looked up. "Hey!" Harper bolted. The door swung open, the bell screaming behind her as she ran into the rain. The cashier's shouts followed her, but she didn't stop. She ducked around a corner, her wet shoes slapping against the pavement. Her lungs burned, but she didn't care. She kept running until the shouts faded and the store was far behind. Finally, she stumbled into another alley and slumped against the wall. She pulled the granola bar from her pocket, her fingers shaking as she tore it open. The first bite tasted like relief, even if the guilt still lingered. She sank to the ground, chewing slowly. Tomorrow, she'd figure out her next move. Tomorrow, she'd search for more answers about Quinn. But for tonight, Harper sat in the rain with her back against the wall and the faint ache of her wings under her skin, and she pretended she wasn't afraid. Chapter 2. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the city shrouded in fog. It crept between the buildings, turning every corner into a smudged shadow. Harper moved through it quietly, her stomach empty but her mind sharp. The stolen granola bar had been enough to get her through the night, but the energy it had provided was already gone. She was running on empty. She kept her head down as she passed a diner tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The flickering neon sign read, "Lenny's All Night," but the way the letters buzzed and the windows fogged over made it look abandoned. It wasn't. Harper had learned that some places like this, run down, ignored by the world, were the safest places to catch her breath. Her steps faltered when she saw someone slip out the diner's front door, glancing over their shoulder before disappearing into the fog. She froze, pressing herself into the shadow of a bus stop. Whoever it was, whatever they were, she didn't want their attention. But the door was still swinging open, and she caught the faint sound of voices from inside. She hesitated, chewing her lip. Voices meant people. People meant information. Quinn could be out there, she reminded herself. And if there was even a sliver of a chance someone knew something, she had to take it. As long as these were her people. And not someone who would turn her in to the government-funded supernatural task force teams that brought in rogue paranormals and shoved them into the naturalization camps famous for turning out reformed paranormals. She shuddered to think what one of those camps might do to her wings to make her pass as human. Harper exhaled and crossed the street. The bell above the diner's door gave a half-hearted jingle as she slipped inside. The smell of greasy food wrapped around her like a blanket, warming her chilled skin. It was brighter than she'd expected. Fluorescent lights, humming against yellowed tile and sticky tabletops. There were only 3 patrons. A man slumped over his coffee, a waitress pouring syrup on a waffle, and 2 individuals huddled in a corner booth. Harper's gaze lingered on them. She couldn't tell what they were, maybe shifters or witches, but the air around them felt wrong, too heavy. An orange spark flashed in the fidgeting hands of one of them, a woman with tangled dreadlocks. Don't stare, she told herself, sliding into a booth 2 tables away and pulling her hood lower over her face. She picked up a worn menu and held it in front of her, pretending to read as their voices grew louder. I'm telling you, Viktor knows, one of them muttered. A man, with a gravelly voice and a growl lurking underneath it. He always knows. You can't trust him, the woman replied. Her sharp voice was edged with panic. You think he's helping you? He's just waiting to bleed you dry. Harper's heart stuttered. She wished she had something to take notes on. She had to remember that name. Viktor. The man scoffed. He's the only one with real answers. You don't go to him unless you're desperate, but when you do, he delivers. Yeah, for a price. Everything's got a price. Harper's hands tightened around the menu, her fingers crumpling the cheap plastic covering. She forced herself to keep breathing. Desperate. That was exactly what she was, wasn't it? And whoever Viktor was, he sounded like someone who could help her find Quinn. Answers, she thought. I just need answers. The woman leaned closer to the man, her voice dropping lower. If you're really going to him, you'd better be careful. Viktor's got his claws in everyone. Humans. Paranormals. Doesn't matter. And he doesn't forget debts. Doesn't matter, the man said. I need to know what happened to my sister. The words struck Harper like a knife to the chest. My sister. She stared at the cracked surface of the table, her vision blurring. She didn't have a sister, but she had Quinn, and he'd been ripped away from her just the same. She'd searched for him for so long, asking questions, following rumors, piecing together a broken puzzle that never seemed to fit. And now, she had a name. Viktor. Her palms itched. She wanted to march over to that table and demand they tell her everything they knew. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew better. Whoever Viktor was, he didn't sound like someone you approached without caution. If this paranormal pair were afraid of him, she'd need to be smarter. Can I help you? Harper jumped, the menu slipping from her fingers. The waitress stood next to her booth, holding a notepad and a chewed-up pen. Her expression was skeptical, her tired eyes scanning Harper's soaked hoodie and dirty sneakers. Just coffee, Harper said quickly. The waitress sighed and scribbled something on the notepad before walking away. Harper glanced at the corner booth, but the pair wasn't whispering anymore. The man was slumped back in his seat, his face turned toward the window, as if the conversation had never happened. Harper's pulse pounded in her ears. She needed to figure out who Viktor was and how to find him. But where did she even start? Asking random paranormals in a city this big could get her killed. Or worse. She clenched her fists and exhaled slowly. One step at a time. For now, she'd stay quiet. She'd listen. And when the time came, she'd find Viktor herself. Harper stood, leaving a crumpled dollar on the table as the waitress returned with her coffee. She didn't dare look back at the booth as she slipped out the door and into the fog. The name echoed in her head with every step she took. Viktor. She didn't know what she was walking into. All she knew was that it had to be better than walking away with nothing. Chapter 3. Harper's search started with a name and nowhere to go. She spent the morning weaving through Portland's fog-drenched streets, ducking under dripping awnings and slipping through alleyways. The city was quieter in the early hours, its underbelly more visible to someone who knew where to look. And she was learning fast. She watched the people no one else watched. Those who moved like they didn't belong. Paranormals didn't wear signs, but if you paid close enough attention, you could spot them. She saw a man's reflection blur in a shop window, his eyes flashing yellow for half a second before he turned away. Later, a woman passed her in the park, wearing a coat too thin for the cold, yet steam rose faintly from her skin as if her body burned hotter than it should. Harper's gaze lingered on these things, her mind racing. She just had to find the right one to talk to. Viktor knows things. The words haunted her, clawing their way into her thoughts. What did Viktor know? Could he really help her find Quinn? And what would he ask for in return? She shoved the questions aside. It didn't matter. Answers were the only thing she wanted, and answers had a price. The first few paranormals she approached turned her away without a glance. A woman with tangled hair and dark eyes sneered when Harper tried asking about Viktor, muttering something in a foreign language before disappearing into a shop. A man she'd thought was a shifter in ripped jeans and a leather jacket laughed outright, but looked concerned as she left and had raised a cell phone to his ear. Harper had run several miles after that, to an entirely different part of the city, where she'd crawled behind a dumpster and dozed off, burning time until she thought she might avoid the STFs that were sure to answer the man's call. She had to be more careful. By the time the sun had reached its dull peak in the clouded sky, her stomach gnawed at her ribs, and her patience had worn thin. She slumped onto a bench at the edge of an empty park, shivering as the damp air clung to her clothes. This isn't working. She'd been naive to think the name alone would get her anywhere. People didn't share secrets without reason. She needed an angle, something to make them talk. Her wings throbbed beneath her skin, a slow and pulsing ache. She rolled her shoulders, grimacing. A sound broke through her thoughts. Laughter, sharp and mocking. Harper looked up. Across the park, two men stood near a bench, arguing loudly. At first glance, they looked normal, but something about them wasn't right. One of them, a pale man with greasy blonde hair, moved his hands too quickly, the motions leaving faint blurs like he was out of sync with the world. The other man was tall and broad, with dark skin and thick boots, and a smile that flashed with two pointed canines. Paranormals. They had to be. She stood, her pulse quickening. They hadn't noticed her yet, too caught up in whatever fight they were having. She crept closer, keeping to the shadows of the bare trees until she could hear their voices. "I told you, I'm not giving you anything," the taller man said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not unless you've got something to trade." The blonde man laughed, a little too loudly. "Come on, Caleb. You know Viktor doesn't care what it costs you. You want him to keep your secrets? Then you pay the price." Harper froze. Viktor. The taller man, Caleb, stepped closer to the blonde, his shoulders tense, You say his name too loud and you'll regret it. Maybe. The blonde grinned, showing teeth that looked too sharp. But I've got debts to pay. Same as you. And if I were you, I'd be careful. Viktor doesn't forget. Her heart pounded. She couldn't let them leave, not before she learned more. Steeling herself, she stepped out of the shadows. Wait. Both men turned sharply, their gazes snapping to her like a pair of wolves catching movement in the woods. The blond man's grin widened. Well, look what we've got here. Harper's instinct screamed at her to back away, but she held her ground. I need to find Viktor. The smile slipped from Caleb's face. You don't want that. I do. She swallowed hard. It's important. The blond man snickered, stepping closer. What's this? A runaway looking for trouble? He sniffed the air, and she flinched. You smell awful. Back off, Ray, Caleb said sharply. He looked her over, his dark eyes narrowing. If you're asking about Viktor, you're already in over your head. I don't care, Harper said. I just need answers. Please. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Ever heard of the Crimson Door? Harper shook her head. Ray shifted uncomfortably next to Caleb, sniffing and thumbing his nose as he glanced around the park. It's located in Old Chinatown. You don't find it, it finds you. If you want something bad enough, look for a paper crane. And if you find it, well, don't say I didn't warn you. Ray chuckled as Caleb turned and walked away. She stood frozen for a beat, her heart still racing. The Crimson Door, a paper crane. She was so close, she could feel it. Harper wandered through Portland's Chinatown as the day faded into a murky twilight. The streets were quieter now, the shop fronts shuttered, and lanterns swaying faintly in the breeze. Her feet ached from walking, and her stomach churned from hunger, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. Viktor doesn't care what it costs you. Caleb's words replayed in her head, gnawing at her. She had nothing to trade. No power. No knowledge. But she couldn't let that stop her. Quinn was out there, and she would crawl through hell to find him. She was about to turn back and find something to eat, even if she had to dig through a dumpster, when she saw it. A paper crane. It perched on the corner of a lamppost, almost hidden in the fog. She froze, blinking hard. The tiny bird looked folded from dark paper, silver patterns etched along its wings glinting in the streetlights. It didn't belong there. Nothing about it made sense. But it didn't feel like an accident either. Before she could think, the crane moved. It hopped, its wings fluttering once before it dropped from the lamppost and landed on the wet pavement. Her heart lurched as she stepped closer. Her eyes widened. The crane was no longer there. It was reflected in a puddle, shimmering faintly in the dim light. What? She whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. The crane fluttered again, its reflection shifting, and Harper watched as it swam across the water, guiding her gaze down a narrow alley. Her pulse quickened. This is insane, she thought. You're following a reflection of an origami figure. But, despite her skepticism, her feet moved anyway. She had no choice. The alley was narrow, its walls covered in graffiti and torn posters. She kept her eyes on the puddles, where the crane's reflection skipped ahead, flitting between water and glass. A shop window, a rain-slick awning, a scrap of metal leaning against a trash bin. At every turn, the city grew quieter. The air seemed to hum. Like it, too, was alive in this world where paper became animated. The crane led her to a darkened street, where it trembled one last time, its reflection shimmering in a nearby puddle, before crumbling into dust. This street seemed like all the other ones around it, at first, except for the paper lantern hanging halfway down. Its red glow was faint, but unmistakable. She stopped at the lantern and stared at the carved wooden door before her. Nothing was ordinary about it. Its pale surface was etched with carvings and Chinese writing, and a faint red light shimmered just beneath the surface, making it look as though light were bleeding through the cracks. The handle was wrought iron, shaped into a curling design that looked almost like wings. Harper glanced both ways down the street, certain someone would run up to chase her off, but only the wind was with her, blowing a candy wrapper across the gravel and trash-strewn alley. Harper's throat tightened. This was it. It had to be. She stepped closer, hesitating at the threshold. The lantern above her swayed, the glow flickering against her skin. A voice broke through the silence, low and smooth as silk. "You found it. Impressive." She flinched, spinning around. A man leaned casually against the far wall of the alley, half hidden in shadow. He wore a long coat that brushed the tops of polished boots, and his smile was slow and sharp, like a blade dragged across stone. How had he gotten there without her hearing? She meant to sound bold and confident, but when she spoke, her words came out as a whisper. "Are you Viktor?" she asked. He pushed away from the wall, stepping into the faint light of the lantern. His eyes were dark, almost as black as his hair, but they caught the glow and held it, like embers waiting to burn. "And if I am?" Harper's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Then I need your help." Viktor's smile widened, showing teeth far too white and far too sharp. "Help isn't free, little bird." Her blood froze in her veins. Could he know what she was? Had he guessed or sensed it somehow? "I don't care," she said, though her voice trembled. "I'll pay whatever it costs." Viktor tilted his head, studying her like she was some strange puzzle he wasn't quite sure how to solve. "Careful. Promises like that will bleed you dry." Harper clenched her fists, fighting the urge to look away from his gaze. "I need answers." The lantern flickered above them, and Viktor's smile sharpened. "Then you came to the right place." He gestured to the door behind her, its crimson light glowing brighter now, as if it were waiting. "Shall we?" Every instinct screamed at her to run, but running hadn't gotten her anywhere but lost, and there was nowhere left to go. Chapter 4. Harper stepped through the crimson door and into a space she didn't quite know how to describe. Dim red light spilled from lanterns hanging on iron chains, casting shadows that rippled across the walls like they had a life of their own. The ceiling was high and arched, smoke drifting near its edges as though the air itself couldn't stay still. A low hum filled the space, so faint it could have been a trick of her mind. The room's far end was shrouded in darkness, but a long counter stretched along the right side, dotted with tarnished silver cups and rows of dusty bottles. A bar, she realized. There were a handful of tables, though none were occupied, and every corner seemed darker than it should be, as though the shadows were waiting. Viktor brushed past her and strode across the room, his footsteps silent despite the creaking floorboards. Harper swallowed hard and followed, trying not to stare at the way the shadows bent around him, like they knew him. "Welcome to the Crimson Door," Viktor said, his voice echoing faintly. "Neutral ground, at least most of the time." Harper hesitated, her fingers twitching. "You live here?" Viktor stopped near the counter and turned, leaning back against it. The faint light sharpened his features, casting deep hollows beneath his cheekbones. "I don't live anywhere, little bird. I wait." "For what?" He smiled faintly, but didn't answer. Instead, he crossed his arms, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "So, tell me again, what makes you think I should help you?" Harper's chest tightened. "Because you're supposed to know things. That's what people say. And what do you have to offer me in return?" He looked over her, disdain clear on his face. The question hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth and then shut it, panic twisting her stomach. I'll figure something out. You must want something." "Want?" Viktor's tone was mocking. "I want many things. None that you're able to afford. Why should I waste my time on a pathetic scrap of a girl with nothing to offer?" Harper clenched her fists. "Because I'm not asking for charity. I'll do whatever it takes to find my brother." "Whatever it takes." Viktor pushed off the counter, stepping closer. His dark eyes glinted, his voice soft but dangerous. "Be careful what you promise, little bird. There are worse things in this world than a missing brother." Harper's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. Quinn is all I have left. I need to find him." Viktor studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he sighed. "You have courage. I'll give you that. But courage isn't currency. Go back to the streets. You're wasting my time." "No." Harper stepped closer, her voice shaking. "I can't. You have to help me." "I don't have to do anything. Please." The sound of splintering wood cut her off. The crimson door exploded inward, shards flying as the walls seemed to shudder with the force. Harper stumbled back, her ears ringing, as men in dark armor stormed through the doorway. Their helmets gleamed under the red lantern light, and a familiar logo shone faintly on their sleeves in reflective material. The Supernatural Task Force, or STF, also known as Stiffs. "Viktor Vadim!" one of them barked, leveling a crossbow that buzzed faintly with silver light. "You are under arrest for unauthorized supernatural dealings." Harper's stomach plummeted. She looked at Viktor, expecting him to panic, but he didn't move. His expression was calm, his posture casual, as though the room hadn't just been invaded. "Lovely timing," he murmured. "Seize him," the agent shouted. The STF advanced. Viktor moved before Harper's eyes could track him, faster than a shadow slipping through light. One of the agents cried out as Viktor slammed him into the wall, the impact cracking wood and stone. Another agent fired, the bolt sizzling as it tore through the air. Viktor twisted aside, and the shot shattered a lantern, sending glass and flame crashing to the ground. Harper flinched, pressing herself back against a table. Her mind screamed for her to run, but she couldn't move. The agents were swarming Viktor, shouting orders she barely understood, and then one of them turned toward her. "There's another one! Grab the girl!" Harper's blood turned to ice. She tried to bolt, but two agents closed in. One snagged her by the arm, his grip bruising, and yanked her back. "Let go!" she screamed, kicking out, but he held fast. Her fear turned white hot. Without thinking, she wrenched her arm free, but the pain that shot through her shoulders was too much. The pressure that had been building for hours, days, broke. Harper hastily shrugged her jacket off and cried out as her back split open. Black wings burst from her skin, unfurling with a slick, wet sound that filled the room. Blood soaked through the fabric of her tank top, dripping down her arms as pain lanced through her entire body. The agent stumbled back, his eyes wide. "What the hell?" Harper didn't give him a chance to finish. Pain and instinct fused into one, and her wings swept outward with a crack of air, knocking the man off his feet and sending him skidding into another agent. Across the room, Viktor held up his arms, trapped in the corner as one of the agents leveled a crossbow at his chest. "Don't move, vampire!" the man barked. Harper acted without thinking. She lunged, her wing snapping forward and buffeting the agent in the head, knocking his shot askew. It hit the wall, harmlessly bouncing off. She pivoted, swinging her wing back into the agent's helmet, with a thud that sent him sprawling. Viktor came up from his duck, blinking and looking between the smoking crossbow and Harper. "I had that handled." "You're welcome," she shot back, already moving on. 2 more agents rushed her, but Harper was faster. She leapt up, flaring her wings to extend her jump. The first agent went down as her feet caught him in the chest, slamming him into a splintered table. The second hesitated, just long enough for Harper to grab a broken chair leg and crack it across his helmet. He crumpled to the floor. The room went still. Harper stood in the center, gasping for breath, her wings dripping blood onto the shattered floorboards. The agents lay motionless around her, alive, but down for the count. She turned toward Viktor, but he wasn't standing where she'd left him. Instead, she caught sight of him darting towards the crimson door, slipping between fallen bodies and shattered furniture. He's running. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't let her only lead get away, not after everything she'd been through to find him. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice ragged. Viktor didn't stop. Adrenaline flooded her veins, the weight of her wings suddenly lighter. She threw herself forward, spreading them wide as she leapt into the air. It wasn't graceful. Her body tilted and her muscles screamed, but she moved. She crashed into Viktor just as he reached the back wall, her sneakers slamming into his shoulders. He stumbled forward with a muffled curse, catching himself against the brick. Harper landed clumsily in front of him, wings flaring wide to block his exit. She could barely stay upright, her knees shaking and her breath ragged, but she didn't move. "You're not leaving until I get what I came for," she shouted, her voice shaking with fury. Viktor straightened slowly, his dark eyes locking onto her wings. For the first time, Harper saw surprise flicker across his face. Not fear, not anger. Just cold, calculating surprise. "Impressive," he murmured, his gaze lingering on the blood soaking her back. "Though you look like you're about to collapse." Harper's hands curled into fists, her wings trembling with effort. "You owe me." "Owe you?" Viktor's lips curled into something that might have been a smirk. "I don't—" "You'd be in custody if I hadn't stuck around and saved your hide," Harper snapped. The room was still chaos behind them. Agents shouting, crossbows firing, the smell of smoke and blood clinging to the air. But none of it mattered. Viktor looked at her, his dark gaze narrowing slightly, like he was reevaluating something. Then he sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Fine. You've proven yourself useful. For now." Harper sagged slightly, relief mixing with exhaustion. Her wings felt heavier by the second, but she refused to fold them just yet. "Then you'll help me?" Viktor sniffed the air, his eyes flashing gold and his lips curling. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then he inclined his head, just a fraction. "I'll consider it," he said, "but you're bleeding all over my floor, little bird." Harper blinked. Her knees buckled, and darkness swam at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was Viktor stepping toward her, his face twisted with hunger and desire. Then everything went black. Chapter 5. Harper's arm ached where the IV pierced her skin. She sat on an old, stiff leather couch, one hand gripping the edge of the cushion as the faint pull of the blood draw left her woozy. The bag of dark crimson liquid hung beside her, filling steadily with the price Viktor had demanded. For his time. Like saving his life wasn't enough compensation for a quick internet search. Across the room, Viktor sat at a sleek desk that looked far too modern for the crimson door. Its glass top gleamed faintly under the light of a desk lamp. His long, pale fingers tapped the keys of a laptop, the glow of the screen, casting sharp shadows across his face. The hum of the IV pump was the only sound for a while, its steady rhythm matching the dizziness in Harper's head. She forced herself to sit still, her jaw tight. She wouldn't let him see how much this unsettled her. The needle, the smell of her own blood hanging in the air, the sickening wrongness of the whole situation. Viktor, of course, seemed entirely at ease. "Comfortable?" he asked, not looking up. "Like a dream," Harper muttered, biting the inside of her cheek to stay focused. He chuckled under his breath, his attention still fixed on the screen. "You're lucky I'm only taking a pint. There are plenty of others who wouldn't be so generous, Raven." The word, so casually spoken, made Harper stiffen. "I don't know what you're talking about." Viktor finally looked up, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, spare me. Wings like yours don't just sprout from anyone. The question is, what are you, exactly? Just a common shifter? You'd like me to think that. Some kind of half-breed? A godling?" Harper stared at him, her expression carefully blank. She didn't even know what she was exactly, but she wouldn't give him that information. "Wouldn't you like to know?" His lips twitched. "I would, in fact." She looked away, her gaze flickering to the IV bag. "Then you'll have to keep guessing." Viktor exhaled sharply through his nose, his version of a sigh. "You're infuriating, you know that." "Good." Silence fell again, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the laptop and the pull of the IV. Viktor's fingers danced over the keys, faster than any humans could. Whatever he was searching for, it clearly required effort. Harper stayed silent, her shoulders tensed, the weight of her wings still aching where they'd torn free hours ago. Finally, Viktor sat back, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Camp Silver Lake." Harper blinked. "What?" "Your brother, Quincy King," Viktor said, his gaze pinning her to the couch. "He was last seen near Camp Silver Lake, a naturalization camp, a rehabilitation program if you believe the news." Harper's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She'd heard about the camps, knew what they were for, and what they did. Humans wanted everyone to believe they were simply for reforming rebellious paranormals, the dangerous ones. But every unregistered paranormal was sent in, and fewer came out. Harper pushed herself upright, ignoring the IV's tug on her arm. "What do you know about it? Who runs the place?" "I haven't bothered to find out, but I will for another pint," Viktor said smoothly. It wasn't worth the blood loss. After the fighting, losing blood from her shifting, and this donation, she wouldn't be able to leave if she gave another. And maybe that was Viktor's plan. She shook her head. Never mind. The idea of Quinn trapped in that place, or worse, sent a wave of nausea through her. Viktor watched her quietly, his expression unreadable. Then he tilted his head. "You know, there's a place for you here, if you're interested." Harper blinked. "What?" "With me," Viktor said. "With my team. A young woman with your abilities is wasted out there, scratching around in the trash." He gestured vaguely, as though he could see the streets of Portland through the walls. "You're something special, Harper, and I don't offer compliments lightly." Harper glared at him. "What exactly are you offering?" He smiled faintly. "Purpose, power, security. You have strength, you just don't know how to use it yet. We'd have to refine you a bit, of course, so you'd fit into a higher society than you're used to, but..." He looked her over, as though appraising a gem. "I'll wager you'd polish up nicely." Harper's jaw tightened. "No." Viktor raised an eyebrow. "No? I'm not interested." He studied her, his dark eyes narrowing just slightly. You don't even know what you're turning down." "I know enough," Harper said firmly. "I'm not going to be anyone's weapon or tool or whatever you think I'd become." Viktor leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against his chin. "Interesting. You're stubborn, I'll give you that." The IV beeped faintly as it finished. Viktor stood, crossed the room with his fluid, silent steps, and pulled the needle from Harper's arm. She winced, pressing a cotton square against the puncture. "You're free to go," Viktor said, tossing the now full blood bag onto the desk beside his laptop. "But if you're smart, you'll stay far away from Camp Silver Lake. My offer stands." Harper stood slowly, her legs shaky. She stared at him for a moment, her thoughts swirling like a storm. He was a vampire, but he'd given her something, a lead. "Thanks," she said stiffly, though the word tasted sour in her mouth. Viktor's smile returned, slow and sharp. "Good luck, little bird. You'll need it." Harper didn't reply. She turned and walked toward the shattered remains of the crimson door, feeling his gaze on her back like a weight. Her arm throbbed where the IV had been, and her shoulders ached with the phantom heaviness of her wings. Camp Silver Lake. The name rang in her head like a warning bell. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she wouldn't stop. Not until she found Quinn. Not until she brought him home. This has been a production of Ravenblood, a Wings of Rebellion prequel novella by Bree. The journey continues in Ravenborn, Wings of Rebellion Book 1, now available on YouTube. The full series is available in ebook and paperback. You can read on Amazon and my website, authorbremore.com. Thank you.